Hello there, creative people. This is Tudor from Blureo, and welcome to Tech Stack Tutorials, where we encourage you to break away from industry standards while respecting accessibility and best practices. Today, we are going to learn how you can achieve a layout like this using multiple fills and gradients inside the Affinity suite. Let's get into it. Before we start, I want to let you know that I am going to use Affinity Publisher in order to achieve the layout that I told you about. This is because I also want to showcase the workflow of combining pixels and vectors in order to achieve stuff like this. If you want to follow along using Affinity Designer and Affinity Photo, you are more than free to do so, since all of the tools that I am going to be using inside of this tutorial are available in the other two apps as well. I am also going to be using Luminar Neo for some AI selections, but this is very easily achievable inside of Affinity Photo or the Photo persona as well. I just want to show you how cool and how quick the workflow is inside of Luminar Neo. Okay, that being said, let's get to work. First things first, since we are going to be playing around with vectors to begin with, let's go into the designer persona from the top left right here. And now by pressing the M tool, we can switch to the shape tool and start building our backdrop, which is just going to be a rectangle to start with. My rectangle right now has the last selected color, so I am going to be pressing D in order to switch back to the default colors. As you can see, my background now has a little black stroke. In order to get rid of that, I'm going to go to the appearance panel and just switch it off like so. Now we can start building gradients. The first one that I am going to address is this tiny one right here. This speck that you can see is exploding into a gradient. This is a conical layer put right on the margin of the shape. Let's select our shape, click on our fill, switch it to a gradient, and from this drop down where you can choose the type of gradient that you want to work with, I will switch to conical. Now let's add some points. I am going to be using the color picker and choose my colors from the swatches that I've set up right here on the left. Great, now by pressing I am going to apply them. By the way, for this tutorial I am using the color of the year 2024 Peach Fuzz, which is this, well, peach color right here. Let's add a couple of points in order to make the gradient a bit more harsh and the transition more sudden. By double pressing right here, I've added two new points and I am going to give them the same colors as before by dragging the color picker. Perfect. This is the gradient I was looking for. By the way, I should also mention that you can add noise to any one of the nodes inside of your gradient. I want some noise on the basic orange that I have inside of this gradient. There is a bug going around now inside of the swatches selection. So here, noise doesn't show up. So I'm going to switch to RGB sliders and then get a little bit of noise. As you can see, it's starting to show up right here, but I want way less than that. Kind of like so. I think that's great. Okay, now I can select my shape again, press G on the keyboard in order to switch to the gradient tool. This will enable this overlay that allows me to control the gradient. And as you can see, I am trying to match it to the one on the top, but I've set these two nodes kind of close together so I can also increase the distance between them from right here inside of the overlay. And this is how I achieve this harsh point gradient effect on the side of my shape. Next in line is this linear gradient effect right here on top, which creates this red darkened overlay effect to my background. In order to add that, I'm going to select my shape, go right here in the appearance panel and click add fill. I'm going to click on my fill, add a gradient. As you can see, by default it's linear, so I just need to pick my colors, add them to my gradient. I am going to be working with red this time in order to create the overlay effect, which I've told you about earlier. And there you go. we already have a linear gradient. I am going to place the red on top, just as in the example above. And I am going to go to my fill again in order to change the opacity of the pitch fuzz node inside of the gradient. Just drag the opacity slider like so. Sometimes it bugs out, but clicking the reverse button fixes the gradient right back. Now that I have my node transparency set to 0, the layer beneath it, which is our conical gradient, has started to reveal itself. But looking at the example above, we can notice that the red combines much subtler with the layer beneath it. So in order to do that, we are going to select the shape again. And as you can see, each of our fill layers for the shape have what is called a blend mode. And by changing this, basically we are changing how the colors on the current layer interact with the colors on any of the other layers. So let's see which one works best for us. I think an overlay would be fine, yes. Moving on, as you can see in our original design right here, we have another spot left to cover right here in the top left corner, which adds a bit of texture and darkens this yes part of the design, which is very important since it adds a bit of grit and drags the attention of the user right here to this part of the image. In order to achieve that, we are going to use the same workflow as we've done before. Select our shape, go here to the appearance panel, add another fill layer, change it to a gradient, and now we have two options, either elliptical or radial. First of all, the elliptical gradient is the option that offers you more control to the sizing of the gradient. When we choose it, as you can see, we have an oval shaped gradient, which we can add color to, just as we've done before, orange in the center and peach fuzz on the margins. And now if we press G, we are met with the same overlay as before, with the nodes and lines showing us where the color is inside of our gradient. What we can do now in order to fine tune our gradient is drag this handle right here. And as you can see, this will change the midpoint of our gradient, changing the color balance inside of our gradient as well. I want to make the orange a bit less inside of our gradient, and now we can redraw it in the corner. I was telling you that the elliptical gradient offers you a bit more control than the radial gradient. This is an oval and the radial gradient is just a circle. So how could we change the size of this oval and its aspect ratio? If you press Ctrl on your keyboard and drag any of those two handles, as you can see, the aspect ratio of my oval is starting to change. I can make its short side longer or its long side shorter, just like so. But as it was before, was best for my image, so I'm just going to leave it like that. Now let's see how the radial gradient could help us in a situation like this. Go to fill again, select your fill, and change it from elliptical to radial. And now when we try to redraw the gradient using G, the gradient tool, as you can see, we only have one handle because the radius of a circle is the same everywhere. Now that I've switched it back to an elliptical gradient, since it offered us more control as we needed it, I am going to play around with opacity and blend mode again in order to achieve the textured effect that we had on top. Let's go here into our gradient, select the light node, drag its opacity all the way down to 0, reverse the gradient a couple of times in order to see the live effect. I will also add a bit of noise right here on our orange node in order to add that bit of texture. Finally, play around with the blend mode so that I can make it a bit more intense. Not as red as the one on top, but I want to make it blend a bit more nicely with the fill layers below. I think overlay looks best still, so I'm going to use this one. As you can see, Affinity offers a multitude of tools, especially the multiple fill tool, in order to let you fine-tune how your gradients interact with each other. In order to get our background truly subject ready, we need to do a couple more things. First of all, I'm going to select it, Press C on the keyboard in order to select the corner radius tool right here. Select all of the nodes of my shape and start dragging. As you can see, this increases the radius of all of the corners of our shape. And what is very cool about using the corner tool is that it is non-destructive. So it doesn't create new nodes. If I would need to do so, I could get into the single node selection tool and start dragging around my node without any consequence on how the shape looks and preserving the corner radius of every single node. But I don't want to do that, so I'm going to Command Z and get right back. The last thing that I need to do for my background is add a texture. And in order to do that, I am going to use Affinity's inbuilt stock photo tool. In order to access it, I am going to go right up here to the window panel, search for the stock window, click on it in order to activate it, and as you can see, our stock photo panel has appeared right here. I am going to search pixels for a texture, and some textures popped up. I'm going to use this one since this is exactly what I used for the top design as well. In order to apply our texture to the shape, I am going to resize it so that it's not that huge and just drag it right here on the layer panel on top of our shape. The last thing that we need to do, we need to change the blend mode of our texture. I think a soft light looks best since it isn't too intrusive, but it still gives that little bit of grit to our design. Okay, so looking at our two designs, I've realized that I've let a bit too much red inside of our linear gradient, but no worry, I can just select it from right there, click on G, and now my overlay is enabled. I can redraw my gradient as I wish, and there you go. Now we have the gradient as we wanted it, with a bit less red and a bit more orange. The next thing we need to do is add a subject to our design. Search for man, and there you go. You could do the selection right here inside of Affinity, but I also want to showcase Luminar. I've already imported my photo inside of Luminar, and it's as easy as selecting it, clicking edit, going to layer properties, masking, there you go. Here you have some AI functions which you can use in order to select. I am going to use the background removal module, click remove, and now we have a PNG ready with absolutely no mistakes, although if we did have any mistakes we could have easily corrected them. Let's say, for example, we have this right over here, which isn't a big problem here, but when you get it onto a colored background, this white dot will be very distracting. So in order to do that, we can go back to the masking, click on brush, go into the erase mode, change the size of the brush a bit, and just start erasing this distracting white part of the image. So you can also add to the selections that AI has done without any problem. So here is our PNG. Now that I've exported my PNG, I can just Command C, Command V inside of Affinity, hold down Shift in order to resize our subject, and there you go. And what we need to do next is clip our subject onto our background, but still leave his head kind of popping out of it. In order to do that, I am going to create another shape by pressing M and dragging down until the bottom of our background. In order to clip our subject to this new shape we've created, I am going to go to the layers panel again and just drag our image right on top of the layer in order to make a child layer out of it. After we've done that, I am going to select our rectangle and remove the stroke and fill for this shape, as I just need it to be a clipping mask. Now, as you can see, this had a visual consequence, which is that we have exactly the desired effect, but it also had a hierarchical consequence, which is that our image is now a child layer and sits right here in this drop down of our rectangle layer. This means that we can also add more things inside of this rectangle layer, and they will all respect this clipping mask. This could be useful because, as you can see here, his arms are a bit too bright, and I might want to add a bit of a shadow on the bottom side of our subject. In order to do that, I'm going to create yet another shape by pressing M, dragging out, changing its fill to a gradient. I will pick the dark red for the bottom of our gradient and the pitch fuzz for the top of our gradient. Now increase the opacity of our gradient to maximum. Redraw the gradient by pressing the letter G. There you go. Drag the handle down in order to increase the pitch fuzz level inside of the gradient and decrease the red level inside of the gradient. And finally, change the blend mode of our rectangle into something a bit less intrusive, like for example, multiply. As you can see, we've achieved the desired effect, but our gradient isn't clipping to our subject. We will need to create a mask in order to do that. So let's switch to our photo persona from the top left right there. Now let's command click on our subject on the image right here in the layers panel. And as you can see, this has created a selection which we can use in order to create a mask. Select the rectangle from your layers panel and click on the mask, Command D, in order to deselect the selection we've done before. Go back to our designer persona, lower the opacity of the pitch fuzz node, which will create this smooth effect. And I also need to remove the stroke of our square. Maybe redraw the gradient, because I think I've made the red way too harsh and unnoticeable. Now we just have 2 or 3 more effects to add, and then we can move on. So I'm noticing that my subject is way too on the right of the image right here. So I'm going to drag him a bit more to the right. Now I'm going to select the image and go right here, just below the layers panel, to the add adjustment layer. Click on the button, add a levels adjustment, increase our black input level, which will turn our blacks darker, decrease our white input level, which will make our whites a bit brighter. This gives our image a bit more contrast. In order to get the subject in the same tone as the gradient behind him, I am going to add another adjustment layer in the form of a gradient map, which is yet another way to creatively use gradients inside of the Affinity suite. So as you can see, what's to the right here, the blues are applied to the brightest areas of the image, and the more you go to the left, you start applying the color to the darker sides of the image. Now I'm going to use the color picker in order to get my gradient map as close to the one above as possible. There you go. I think it's starting to look a bit better already, but I need to darken this red quite a lot since I want the shadows to keep their darkness. So I'm going to select the red again and just drag the red level back down in order to create a bit more contrast. Now for the final adjustment to our image, I am going to drag the opacity down a bit. I can also play around with this shadow gradient that we've created before. I am just going to change it to a darker red, drag down the opacity a bit because it was also too visible. And there you go. You could think that this adjustment will go unnoticed in your design, but let's disable it for just a bit. And there you go. Can you see how bright his hands are? Your eyes immediately go to his bicep right there instead of going to the face, which is what we're trying to communicate, since this is not an ad for a gym, but rather for a website building app. As you can see, the whites in the image below are way less brighter than the whites in the image above, but I can always adjust that with my levels adjustment that I have, because this is the advantage of a non-destructive workflow. In order to move on to the next step, we need to add a very subtle drop shadow to our character in order to blend him and integrate him in the scene really. To do that, there are multiple ways which we could go, but my favorite, and in my opinion the easiest, is to just copy the image to the curve that we've created for the background, drag and drop it onto the curve, and now it's going to be clipped to our background. Let's go right here to the effects panel, which will toggle the layer effects window. Now we can add an outer shadow right here. I like to set it to something very obvious, increase the radius, increase the opacity a lot to begin with, and use the offset tool in order to place it wherever I want it. After I've placed my shadow where I think it would land according to the lighting of the subject, I am going to experiment a bit with the opacity and multiple blend modes, which I could use in order to make it a bit more natural. Works perfectly in our case. Now that our background and subject are all set up, let's just apply the finishing touches. Texture looks kind of bland compared to the one on top, and our contrast looks a bit weak. So I've selected the texture from down here, and I'm going to apply an adjustment layer to it as well. I'm going to go with levels, increase the black input level, decrease the white input level, and there you go. Now we have decent contrast and texturing on our image. Now, in order to start writing, we can press T on the keyboard for text in order to enable the artistic text tool. Type our text, in this case, yes. It already has the color because I had it selected, but you could just press I on the keyboard for your color picker tool and select whichever color you want. The yellow right behind me here works perfectly in this case, so I am going to stick to it. Finally, in order to blend our big text right here into the background, I am going to go to the layer blend modes again and switch our layer blend mode to overlay. Now that that's done, as you can see, our background started to slightly seep through our typography, and that's exactly the effect I was looking for. Now that we're done with the big typography, before we move on to the final text that we need to add and the effects we're going to add to it, I am noticing that our subject needs to be dragged a bit back to the left. That's how design works. You always notice that you've overdone something a bit and you need to go back to it. So let's select our subject and also the shadow that we've applied behind him and just drag them ever so slightly to the left. Let's go ahead and add the final text and effects. Press T again to start writing. As you can see, we already have a big problem, which is our text is full caps, but no worries. We are going to go into the window panel as we usually do when we feel lost or we cannot find a tool. And we are going to scroll down to text and find the character panel. Now that we've added the character panel, let's dock it to the left and we can start adjusting our character style again. As we suspected, the problem was inside of the character panel. As you can see, our all caps character style was enabled, but I can still see a problem, which is the spacing between the letters, the tracking is way too narrow. In order to fix that, I can go to the character panel again and change the tracking to 0. There you go. Now we have a text with no problems. Next, I am going to change the text color to white. The can will be yellow, so I am going to select it. Fill panel, change the color to the yellow. Finally, before duplicating our text and changing it according to each line, I need to add this shadow 3D effect to it, so that every time I duplicate it, the next layer gets the same property. In order to get that effect, I am going to go to the effects panel, add an outer shadow, but this time change its radius to 0. Use my offset tool and ever so slightly drag my shadow. Also, instead of using the offset tool, if you want to be a bit more precise, you can use the angle tool right here, combined with the offset slider, so that you can fine adjust your shadow. Now let's change the color to this red swatch and change the blend mode to something that would again make it pop a bit more like linear light. Now that we have everything ready for our final text, we can drag it right above the subject inside of our layer hierarchy so that we can put it in front of him with no problems. And by command dragging, we can add 2 more lines of text, which would say, yes, you can build sites directly. Since we are inside of Affinity Publisher, it's going to auto capitalize because they've thought it out as a publishing software. But I've told you, and as you can see, it's way more powerful than that. Now for the final line, we are going to only keep the yellow text. Finally, let's quickly add this kind of highlight to our final line of text. Build a rectangle, just as I've done before. Send it to the back by pressing Command and the left square bracket. Then use the corner radius tool in order to give it a bit of a radius. Change its color to the red that we've been using throughout our document. Change the blend mode of our fill to something a bit more pleasing, like soft light. Completely disable the stroke of this element since we won't be needing it. Finally, in order to achieve that sort of 3D effect for our highlight, I'm going to add a drop shadow to it. So let's enable outer shadow from right here. Click on the offset tool, drag our shadow to right where we want it to be. Maybe change its color to one of our swatches. I think the orange would be great. And see if another blend mode would help us more than the default overlay one. I think glow looks okay, so we're going to leave it like that. Then drag the curve right beneath our subject, and there you go. This is our design. Of course, we could sit around here and fine-tune this until we reach the exact same result we did the first time, but that's not the purpose of this video. The purpose of this tutorial is to show you how you can creatively put to use the tools that Affinity offers, and especially gradients, multiple fills, and gradient maps. If you've enjoyed it and you have any suggestions as to how this channel could evolve and what we should do next, please leave them in a comment down below, subscribe to this channel, and see you in the next one. Bye bye.